Welcome to our channel. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Thierhart, and until recently my biggest problems were paperwork, finicky buyers, and trying to sneak out early on a Friday without my inbox exploding. I run a real estate firm on the ragged edge of the city, selling starter homes, rentals, and the occasional good bones property that needs a hell of a lot more work than the listing photos admit. Emma and I were practically newlywed, still figuring out how to share a whole life instead of just sharing weekends. Most weeks blurred together in a gray wash of showings, inspections, conference calls, and clients who changed their minds at the absolute last minute. Evenings were the only time the noise stopped. We'd settle in with dinner, Netflix running low in the background, her feet tucked under my leg on the couch, and that calm, heavy feeling that says the day is finally over. Emma works in agricultural support, which means farms call when yields drop or soil goes bad, and she shows up with a notebook, sample kits, and clear answers. She loves the outdoors, and she respects routines that keep things growing and healthy. Weekends were where the friction usually lived. Hunting is my reset button, and I won't pretend it's only about filling the freezer with venison. It's about being out there where the static dies down, and you can actually hear your own thoughts. Emma respects the woods too, but the timing wore on her. She would watch me stage gear by the door, arms crossed, and say, "So you're gone again." We barely saw each other all week. And it wasn't a fight exactly, just a quiet, discover more. Hinduism, flora and fauna, TV and video equipment, disappointment we both felt. Late fall dragged toward early winter with steady cold rain, short daylight, and a wind that kept getting sharper. The neighborhood looked normal on the surface, but the rhythm felt off. Grocery shelves stayed thin for too long. People stopped making eye contact in line. Conversations got shorter and sharper. Doors shut faster. There was a tightness in the air you couldn't blame on the weather. I had an answer to that anxiety hidden deep in the trees, buried under a giant trunk. And I still hadn't told Emma the full story. That secret was about to stop being optional. If you grew up around deer camps or serious hunters, you learned two things early. Most people think it's just a hobby involving beer and camouflage, and the woods fundamentally don't care whether you live or die. My friends and I headed out most weekends once the season opened. And even when we came home empty-handed, we came back decompressed, calmer. Emma understood that part on paper. What rubbed her wrong was the timing of it all. Friday night would finally show up. The work week would bleed off. She'd cook a nice dinner. We'd sit down. And then Saturday morning, I'd be loading gear into the truck while she stood in the hallway in her socks, trying hard not to take it personally. "You work all week," she said once, leaning against the doorframe, her voice flat and tired. "Then the weekend comes and I get the leftovers." I didn't have a good defense because she wasn't wrong. So I just answered, "It's not about avoiding you, Em. It's about staying sharp. I need a reset." And she nodded. But the tight look on her face said we'd talk about it later. Hunting also kept my brain in planning mode. You spend enough time in freezing weather thinking about water filtration, fire starters, and what happens if you break a leg 5 miles from the truck, and you start noticing how incredibly fragile normal life actually is. Last year there was a stretch when the season was closed, the real estate market cooled off, and I had time on my hands that didn't feel natural. Instead of wasting it on golf or yard work, I started walking the deeper strip of woods behind our suburb. The gnarly part most people skip, because it's thick with briars, wet, and full of rot and deadfall. It's close enough to reach fast if you run, but far enough out that you don't hear the highway hum. That's where I found the tree, an old giant of hardwood with a massive base, roots heaving out of the ground like heavy ribs, and hard-packed earth where the rain ran off the sides instead of pooling underneath. Standing there, the spot felt solid. And more importantly, it felt ignored, which is exactly what you want if you're trying to hide something from the world. The idea came in steps. Music first, I just wanted a place to stash emergency gear and sit out storms. Then it evolved into a fallback, a quiet spot that wasn't tied to the power grid and wasn't full of strangers. Emma didn't know at first. Part of it was embarrassment. Grown men don't usually build forts. And part of it was that once you say a plan out loud, you're responsible for it. So it stayed a private project. Stolen weekends and late afternoons. Just me and work gloves with a folding shovel and a blueprint I kept in my head. Digging was the hardest part, mostly because fresh dirt in a dark forest is a billboard. A pile of raw soil screamed, someone was here. So I moved it in tedious small amounts, spreading it under heavy brush and using leaf litter to cover the scars. A simple rule kept me honest. If I could see the disturbed ground from 10 steps away, I fixed it until I couldn't. The shelter started as a basic root cellar, a room big enough for 4 people to sit and sleep without stacking like cordwood. The walls were the priority because bare dirt crumbles and sweats, and that turns your survival space into a damp tomb. I lined the sides with pressure-treated boards I could carry in quietly, braced them tight against the earth, and planned to add foam insulation later behind the boards once I was sure the spot stayed dry. The entrance was the part that made it real. I cut a narrow hatch inside the hollow of the trunk, keeping it low and plain with a small door that looked like an old wood knot, unless you knew exactly where to touch. Inside the trunk, a short ladder dropped down into the room, and a heavy latch locked from the inside because the best lock is the one nobody knows exists. Everything inside stayed simple and utilitarian. A small wood stove for dry heat, a folding cot for me and Emma, a small table, 2 chairs, and storage racks built against one wall. I stocked it with bags of wheat and buckwheat sealed in buckets, canned goods, freeze-dried meals, and water jugs stacked low against the earth berm to keep them from freezing. A hygiene corner sat behind a canvas curtain featuring a folding camp toilet, heavy-duty waste bags, and a vent pipe that ran up through the root space and out through the trunk so damp air and smells didn't settle in the room. For washing, it was a simple sprayer bag and a hand pump. We'd warm water on the stove, then do a quick rinse and towel off because puddles on the floor turn into mold, and mold is an enemy you can't shoot. One carbon monoxide alarm sat on the shelf with fresh lithium batteries, because a stove in a tight room can turn deadly without warning. Dry kindling stayed in a lidded bin, so bugs didn't ride in with the wood. I walked the route in and out a dozen times in different lighting, picking landmarks that looked natural but distinct. If I could find it in the pitch dark, we could too. It wasn't finished like a vacation cabin with creature comforts. It was finished like a tool. Enough to work and enough to trust with your life. And every time Emma asked what I did with my free weekends, I just smiled and said, just catching up on some projects, knowing that one day I'd have to tell her which project mattered most. Let's get one thing clear. The shelter wasn't some concrete doomsday bunker with fluorescent halls or yellow warning signs. It was a hidden room tucked under the biggest tree I could find, built to disappear, built to stay bone dry, and built to function even if the entire neighborhood grid went dark. Getting to it mattered just as much as building it. From the last row of manicured backyards, you cut into the thicker timber and follow a route that looks like absolutely nothing special. There's no straight trail, no blaze marks on branches, music, and absolutely no footprints that I couldn't erase. When the ground was wet, I stepped exclusively on exposed roots and rocks. And on the way out, I swept the soft dirt with a pine bow because a clean boot track in the mud is basically a neon arrow pointing right at your front door. The entrance sat directly in the trunk. From a distance, it looked like rough bark and old scars, the kind of texture every massive tree collects over decades. Up close, there was a narrow seam. And if you pressed one specific spot, the hidden latch gave a soft, satisfying click. The little door opened inward so wind and grabby vines couldn't pry it loose. And inside the hollow, a short, sturdy ladder dropped straight down. When the hatch shut above you, the outside sound didn't just vanish. It got dull and heavy like the tree itself was swallowing the noise. The room was sized for utility, big enough for 4 adults to sit without knees knocking together, and big enough for 2 to sleep without feeling stacked like cargo. The floor started as packed soil, but I laid down sleepers and thick boards so our boots never touched damp ground. The walls were the first real engineering problem. Bare dirt sheds grit, holds moisture, and eventually slumps in on you. So I set simple posts, braced them hard, and lined the sides with pressure-treated boards I could carry in quietly. Later, when I had time to finish it right, I added a vapor barrier of thick plastic and foam insulation behind the boards, so the room held heat without trapping wet air against the cold earth. Heat came from a small cast iron wood stove. I kept it modest on purpose because a huge stove eats wood too fast and turns a tight room into a sweat box. This one gave steady, dry heat and let you cook on the flat top if you had to. A pipe ran up through the root space and out through the trunk, sealed tight with high-temp silicone so smoke didn't leak back in. A carbon monoxide alarm sat on a shelf with a brick of spare batteries because wood heat is great until it isn't. And you don't always get a warning you can feel before you pass out. Sleeping was simple. A folding double bed stayed against one wall with a dense foam pad and a heavy wool blanket, and 2 extra sleeping bags stayed rolled in a bin just in case. A small table folded down from the wall and 2 chairs tucked under it. Those chairs mattered more than I expected because you can handle a bad night on the floor, but you can't handle weeks of it without your back paying the price. Storage lived on the cold wall, away from the stove. I used sealed food-grade buckets and littered heavy-duty bins because cardboard invites mice and dampness. Wheat and buckwheat went into mylar sacks inside the buckets, and canned food was stacked low so nothing could tip over. Coffee, salt, and a few morale foods like chocolate and honey stayed together because when you're tired and scared, a warm, sweet drink can keep you from making dumb choices. The water strategy was split into 2 tiers. I had drinking water in one set of jugs and washed water in another just to get us started. But the long-term plan wasn't to haul water in. It was to use the stainless steel pot and the filter to melt and clean the snow that covered the woods outside. Relying only on stored jugs is a rookie mistake. You run out too fast. The hygiene corner was small, but absolutely not optional. A folding bucket toilet sat behind a canvas curtain with heavy bags. A scoop of dry sawdust to kill the smell and wipes in a sealed container. A narrow vent pipe ran up and out. Music, and most days, the thermal draft pulled air without a fan. For washing, I kept a pump sprayer and a hanging bag. You warm water on the stove, take a quick rinse, and use a towel. No puddles on the floor allowed because puddles mean damp socks music, and damp socks turn into blisters and infection when you can't dry them out. Light followed one rule: light discipline. Headlamps and a small LED lantern stayed in a box near the ladder, but they were used like tools, not for comfort. Batteries stayed organized so nobody rummaged in the dark. A hand-crank radio stayed in the same box because if the power and internet die, you still want a human voice telling you what's happening beyond the tree line. Tools were basic but high quality. A framing hammer, a handsaw, a drill with spare charged batteries, screws, duct tape, and a few spare parts for the stove pipe. Rolls of plastic sheeting stayed ready because they can block a draft or cover a leak instantly. First aid stayed high and easy to reach, stocked with clean bandages, trauma pads, antiseptic, and the actual prescription meds we use, not just random junk. Defense was present, but it wasn't the plan I wanted to use. A hunting rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun fit the way I already trained, and a handgun stayed locked in a small hard case. Nothing lived loaded. The simple rule was, if you touch it, you treat it like it can fire, and you never point at anything you don't mean to destroy. When I finally told Emma the shelter existed, I kept my voice steady and said, "I built a place we can go if the crowds get dangerous." She stared at me for a long second, processing, then asked, "You did all of this without telling me?" I nodded and answered, "I wanted it real and finished before I made you carry the worry." She walked closer, ran her hand over the rough boards, and said, "If we ever use it, we keep it clean and we keep it quiet." That was her yes, and it was also her warning that if we ever climbed down here for real, we would be trusting this hole in the ground with our lives, and there wouldn't be any time to argue about it. Friday night rolled in cold and wet, with rain pecking relentlessly at the windows. Dinner was done. The dishwasher was humming, and the house finally felt settled. Emma was curled up on the couch under a fleece throw. Netflix was playing low, and she was half watching while flipping through soil analysis notes from a farm visit. I was just sitting there staring at the screen, trying to force my work brain to shut down for the weekend. We were halfway through a sitcom episode when the screen snapped to black, and that jarring two-tone emergency alert system screech punched through the quiet room. A county seal appeared, followed by a voice that was trying too hard to sound calm. The message was clinical but terrifying. An unknown biological agent had been confirmed. Individuals were exhibiting sudden extreme aggression. And the order was to shelter in place, lock all doors and windows, and strictly avoid contact with anyone acting confused or erratic. Emma sat up fast, phone already in hand, and asked, "Is this a test?" "It has to be a test, right?" The scrolling red text at the bottom used the word civil danger warning, and that sucked the air right out of her question. The voice repeated the instructions slower this time, and then the broadcast dumped us unceremoniously back into our show like nothing had happened. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The laugh track from the TV felt obscene. Emma looked over at me, eyes wide, and said, "Okay, Thier, what does that actually mean?" A stupid, comforting answer wanted to come out, something like it's probably just a hacker or a mistake, but the specific frequency of that alert didn't feel like a mistake. "It means we lock up," I said, standing up because sitting felt too much like waiting to die. I walked to the slider and added, "We stay inside. We kill the lights and we wait for real information." Locks came first because that's the only variable you can control in mine at 1, 0, 0. Deadbolts, music, back door, garage keypad, and then the heavy curtains. Even though it was barely 8, 0, 0 p. Emma hovered near the kitchen island, tapping her screen. She tried her parents, then pulled the phone away with that tight, frustrated look that says the music call failed. "Network busy," she said, voice thinning. "It won't connect." She tried again. Anyway, the local news was already running a breaking banner. The anchors used careful, practiced faces and soft language, and one of them kept insisting the situation was localized, while his eyes flicked off camera like someone was feeding him lines he didn't believe. Then the clips started spreading online. Shaky vertical videos with flashing lights, crowds scattering in a panic, and one clear shot that made my stomach drop. A man in business casual sprinting at a stranger and tearing into his shoulder with the kind of force that ignores pain completely. Emma watched the clip once, then handed the phone back to me like it was radioactive. She hugged her arms and said, "That's not a fight. Their people don't fight like that. That's not normal." I didn't argue because there wasn't a rational explanation that fit. And the comment sections were already a mix of bad jokes and raw panic. Strangers telling each other to calm down while posting proof that nobody could. We had supplies mostly because we both liked being ready for ice storms. Water cases in the basement, canned soup, rice, oats, batteries, a generator in the garage with 5 gallons of fuel, and dry wood under the patio cover. It wasn't a doomsday stash, just enough to ride out a bad week. But a stocked house in a tight suburban neighborhood turns into a target. The second fear turns into hunger. Through the blinds, the street looked normal, but the vibe was thinning fast. Cars rolled past slower than usual. Drivers looking at houses. A dog barked aggressively for 2 minutes straight, then cut off into silence. Somewhere down the block, a door slammed hard, and voices rose quick and sharp, like neighbors arguing over who owned what. Emma kept her voice steady, but I could hear the tremor when she asked, "If they told people to stay home, shouldn't we just stay here?" She was thinking like a person who expects the social contract to hold. "The system just told everyone not to help each other," I answered, keeping my volume low. "That's the part that scares me. They're effectively saying you're on your own." Another alert hit our phones an hour later, shorter and harsher. "Curfew in effect. Avoid public gatherings. Do not travel toward the city center." It didn't say help was coming, and it didn't say when it would end. It just laid down rules and left everyone to improvise. Emma looked at me like she was measuring the structural integrity of the house for the first time and said, "Tell me you have a plan, a real one." The words landed heavy because the truth was that I did, and I had effectively lied by omission for months. "I built a place," I said, keeping my tone flat to keep her calm. "In the deeper woods, it's hidden. It's fully stocked, and it's not in the middle of this mess." She didn't yell, and she didn't smile with relief either. She just stared at me and said, "You built a whole shelter and you didn't tell me." I nodded once and answered, "I wanted it to be real before I made you carry the worry of it." She exhaled hard, looked at the door, then back at me. "Okay, we'll talk about the secrets later, but if we do this, we do it together, and you stop hiding things from me right now." Outside, a siren rose, joined by another, and then both died at the same time, like someone threw a master switch. A crash sounded down the street, glass shattering, and a voice shouted, followed by a sound that wasn't human speech. Emma's hand found mine, her fingers cold and gripping tight. And she asked, "When do we go?" I looked at the dark window and said, "At first light, we pack quietly. We take only the essentials, and we disappear before the roads fill up." Once we started moving, we didn't stop. We didn't turn the house into a chaotic command center. We just moved with grim purpose and kept our voices low. Emma cleared the kitchen island, set 2 heavy-duty totes and our hiking packs on it, then looked at me and said, "Tell me what matters and what gets left behind." I opened the pantry and answered, "Hug calories, hydration, thermal layers, medical tools, and the hardware to make the shelter tight. Everything else is just dead weight." Cans went first because they stack. They music, last forever, and they don't ask questions. Beans, hearty soups, tuna, chili, and fruit. Rice, pasta, and oats followed, plus peanut butter, instant coffee, salt, and a large jar of local honey. Emma slid into the pile like it was non-negotiable. "You can survive on plain calories," she said, catching my look. "But you don't want to. Flavor matters when you're miserable." I nodded, said, "Morale counts as a survival essential," and kept loading. Water was next. We grabbed cases from the basement, 2 larger jerry cans, and a high-quality filter with spare ceramic elements. Emma hefted 1 5-gallon jug, frowned at the dense weight, and said, "We can't haul a whole basement through the woods on our backs." "We don't have to," I answered, pointing toward the back door. "The shelter has a baseline of water stored. This is just to get us there, without stopping to pump from a creek." Warm gear went on top like a protective lid. Wool socks, merino base layers, work gloves, knit caps, rain shells, and 1 heavy wool blanket. Cold doesn't kill you fast when you're dry, but wet clothes and freezing air will humble anyone in an hour. Emma asked why I tossed in a roll of contractor trash bags, and I said, "They keep gear dry, they can carry wood, and they can tape over a draft. Multi-purpose is king." Medical stayed strictly in Emma's lane. She dumped our home first aid kit on the counter and rebuilt it with calm speed, discarding the fluff and keeping the gauze, medical tape, antiseptics, strong pain meds, allergy pills, and the antibiotics we had left over. She sealed it all in a heavy freezer bag, pressed the air out, and said, "If you get hurt out there, we are the clinic. There's no 911. Tools were my department. A compact bag. Got a framing hammer, screws, duct tape, a folding saw, a small pry bar, a headlamp, spare lithium batteries, and a coil of paracord. Rope isn't fancy, but it lets you lift things quietly and keep your back intact." Emma watched me at it and said, "You stocked this place like you expected to use it this week." I answered, "I built it because crowds scare me more than the weather ever could." Defense came last because firearms changed the energy in a room. The safe was in the master closet. Emma stood beside me while I spun the dial, and neither of us joked. A hunting rifle went into a scabbard on my pack. Ammo stored separately. The shotgun followed for close-range problems. A compact handgun stayed in a locked box inside the tote. Nothing left the house loaded. The rule was simple. If it comes out, the muzzle stays safe. And if we don't need it, it stays put. The final tote was for critical upgrades. Foam, weather stripping, silicone sealant, extra screws, and a roll of insulation we could stuff behind boards once we were down there. Emma tapped the insulation roll and said, "So, we're remodeling while the world burns." "Small fixes keep small problems from becoming life-threatening ones," I said. Before we moved anything outside, the house got locked down. Lights killed at the breaker, curtains drawn tight, thermostat set to hold. I left a short note on the counter with Emma's parents' number. Not sentimental, just practical logic. Emma stared at it for a second and said, "This feels like quitting." I answered, "This feels like not getting trapped in a box." We staged the packs and totes in the garage, keeping the door down so nobody watched us prep. The shelter was close enough that we didn't need a vehicle. Driving would just advertise our movement, but we needed a clean exit. Just before dawn, we stepped out into a cold, gray mist. The neighborhood looked normal structurally, but it sounded thin, like the whole street was holding its breath. A car rolled past slowly, headlights off to stay low profile. The air smelled like wet leaves and distant wood smoke. A neighbor in a gray hoodie stood in his driveway, staring blankly at the street. He spotted us and called out, voice cracking slightly, "You guys leaving?" I kept walking, adjusting the heavy pack, and said, "Just getting some supplies." He stepped closer to the property line and asked, "Did you hear anything else on the radio?" "No," I answered, "and I'm not waiting for the next message." Then I added, "Lock up, man. Don't open your door for anyone acting sick or confused." He gave a nervous, high-pitched laugh and said, "They're opening emergency shelters at the high school gym." I kept my voice even and said, "Shelters are crowds and crowds are dangerous." Then nodded once and moved on before the conversation turned into a desperate plea to join us. We avoided the main road entirely, cutting behind the backyards into a drainage easement that led straight to the tree line. The key was not looking like refugees on the run. Steady pace, no flashlights, no talking unless it mattered. Emma adjusted her pack strap, winced at the weight, and whispered, "If someone sees us walk into the woods with all this, they'll follow." "Not if we don't leave them a trail," I whispered back, and I brushed a fresh boot mark with a handful of wet pine needles as we passed. 2 streets over, shouting rose up, sharp, ugly, and panicked. Then came a sound that didn't fit a domestic fight. A low, wet moan that carried too far in the cold, damp air. Emma stopped dead, eyes wide, and I said, "Keep moving." Because standing still in a neighborhood is how you become a statistic in someone else's emergency. At the edge of the strip, we saw the reality of it. A man in a soaked windbreaker stood near a mailbox, head hanging low, swaying like he was exhausted or drunk. When he turned, his movement was slow and stiff, mechanics grinding, and there was dried blood smeared around his mouth. He didn't sprint. He just started walking toward the distance, shouting like it was a dinner bell. Emma's voice came out thin and shaky when she said, "There, that's real." "Yeah," I answered. "And it stays out here. We don't." The tree line swallowed us fast. Traffic noise faded into the damp mulch. Wet branches brushed our sleeves. We stepped deliberately on roots and rocks, so we didn't carve a clean path in the mud. Rushing makes noise, and noise makes mistakes. The giant trunk showed up the way it always did, not like a signpost, but like a massive silent wall. Emma slowed, stared at the rough bark, and said, "If this actually works, you owe me a very long conversation." I found the hidden seam in the bark, put my hand there and said, "Deal." Then pressed the latch and music, listened for the soft mechanical click. The hidden door in the trunk swung inward with a soft scrape of bark on bark, and cold, damp air spilled into the hollow space. Emma leaned in, eyes narrowed as she traced the seam, and said, "You hid this in plain sight. I've walked past this tree 20 times. I kept my voice low and answered, "It only works if it looks boring." Then I stepped onto the ladder and went down first so she could see it was solid and grounded. The ladder ended on a small wooden landing, and the room opened up below, noticeably warmer than the biting air outside. A battery-powered lantern sat on the shelf where I'd left it. When I clicked it on, The white light hit smooth, board walls instead of raw, crumbling dirt. Emma climbed down slowly, looked around at the stocked shelves in the sleeping cot, and said, "Okay, this is real." And the relief in her voice came mixed with a sharp edge of betrayal, because I'd kept this massive secret in my back pocket for months. The first priority was closing the hatch and listening. The outside world didn't vanish, but it got dull and distant. The rain tapping on the forest floor sounded miles away. I waited a few seconds, letting our breathing settle, then told her, "Give it a minute before we talk loud. Sound can travel up that trunk like a chimney." Emma nodded once, looking at the ceiling, and asked, "Does it actually breathe down here, or are we going to suffocate?" "It breathes," I answered, and I showed her the simple setup. One vent line carried warm, stale air up and out, while a second line brought fresh oxygen in behind a wallboard. "Most days, the thermal draft moves it on its own," I said. "And if the air feels heavy, we crack the hatch for a short minute when it's quiet." Emma felt the faint draft near the intake and said, "Good. Stale air makes people slow and stupid." The landing zone by the ladder became the wet gear station by default. Jackets went on hooks. Boots went onto a rubber tray, and a towel hung near the stove. Emma pointed at the tray and said, "Thank you." And I knew she meant thank you for thinking about the mess before we were too stressed to care. Heat came next. I laid dry kindling, then small splits of hardwood, and struck a flame. Emma watched the fire catch and asked the obvious question, "How much smoke shows outside?" "Not much if the pipe stays sealed and the wood is bone dry," I answered, though I didn't lie about the risk. "We don't run it hot unless we absolutely have to, because smoke is visible, and wood means trips outside to restock." When the fire caught properly, the atmosphere in the room changed fast. The damp, earthy edge faded, replaced by the smell of dry pine and heat. Emma held her hands toward the stove and said, "This is the first thing tonight that feels normal." We ate a simple, quiet meal. Peanut butter, crackers, canned fruit, and water. Cooking smells carry, and the first night wasn't the time for comfort meals like chili. Emma sat on the edge of the folding bed, chewing slowly, and said, "I am furious with you for doing this behind my back." Then she took a breath and added, "But I'm also incredibly glad you did it." I sat in the chair across from her and answered, "You're allowed to be both." Then I softened my tone and said, "I should have told you sooner." "I know that." She kept her voice steady and asked, "Why didn't you?" "Because once you know," I answered, "you carry the weight of it. You think about it every time you hear a siren or see a bad headline. And I wanted you to have just one more normal year." Emma stared at me for a long second, then said, "Next time you build a life raft for us, you tell me before you finish it." "Deal," I answered, and that was the end of it. After we ate, we ran the music checks that keep small rooms safe. The carbon monoxide alarm got tested with a chirp. The intake vent got checked for blockage. I ran my fingers along the stove pipe collar, looking for any sign of soot or leaks. Emma watched me work and said, "You're doing this to calm yourself down." "Yeah," I answered. "And it works." Then I handed her a fresh notepad and a pen. "Start a manifest. I need a list of what we have and what we burn through." She started writing immediately. Water, food, batteries, meds, wood. Then she looked up, pen hovering, and asked, "How often do you plan to go out?" I didn't dodge the question. "Once a week," I answered. "Only if it's dead quiet, only in daylight, and only for a short logistical trip." Then I added, "If the neighborhood turns into a crowd or a war zone, we stop going out entirely." Emma tapped the pen on the paper and said, "If you go out, you don't come back down here without checking yourself first." "Agreed," I said, and I pointed at the hygiene corner behind the curtain. "Boots off, hands clean, and if there's any blood on you, we handle it outside." She nodded and said, "Good." Then she added, "Because a sickness or infection down here is worse than anything waiting up there." Later, while the stove settled into a steady low glow, we opened the tote with the foam strips and insulation. Not because we needed it right then, but because having it ready meant we wouldn't rush later. I held a strip against a drafty seam by the ladder frame, and Emma pressed it in tight. "So this is our honeymoon," she said. Half a joke, but mostly tired. I looked at her and answered, "Just don't die on me and we'll call it even." Sleep took a while to arrive. The bed was there, but the room still felt new, and new environments make your brain listen for problems. Emma lay down in her warm layers and pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin. I slid in beside her, eyes on the ceiling boards, ears tuned to the trunk. Sometime after midnight, shouting rose far away in the distance and then cut off fast music, like someone slammed a heavy door. Emma's hand found my arm in the dark. I kept my breathing slow and whispered, "Stay still." The sounds didn't come closer, and the woods eventually went quiet again. Morning didn't arrive with sunlight down here. It arrived with routine. The stove got fed. Water got measured. Emma sat up, rubbed her eyes, and said, "If we're doing this, we do it clean." Then she pointed at my damp socks from the hike and added, "And we start with those, change them." I laughed once, low and tired, and said, "Yes, ma'am." When we finally cracked the hatch to check the air and listen, the outside world sounded the same. Rain and distant noise, but the difference was we were under a tree, out of sight, and moving on our own terms. The next problem was figuring out how to get more supplies in without leaving a trail that a desperate person could follow. The first week bled into a rhythm that felt almost boring. And honestly, boring was the strategic goal. The stove got fed in measured small pieces to keep the smoke invisible. Water got rationed by the cup, and the shelter stayed just warm enough to dry out damp wool socks. Emma set up a decontamination corner by the ladder without making a speech about it. Boots on the rubber tray, jackets on specific hooks, disinfectant wipes ready in a pop-top bin. She'd glance at the floorboards and say, "If you drag mud across those boards, you're wiping it up instantly." And it landed like a law of physics, not a request. A tight room forces conversations you can dodge in a normal house. The first real friction was over light discipline. I wanted the LED lantern on while we ate because dim corners make my nerves jump, and Emma wanted it off unless we were working. She watched my hand reach for the switch, then said, "We don't waste batteries just because you feel uneasy in the dark." And I answered, "I just want to see what I'm eating, Em." And she shook her head and said, "Then use the red light on your headlamp and turn it off between bites. Lumens are finite." We let it go and ate in the softer red glow, looking like submarine crewmen. The bigger argument was about going topside. Emma wanted a clean promise that we'd stay underground until the radio gave an "I'll see." And I wanted eyes on the neighborhood because not knowing is how people make fatal guesses. She sat at the folding table with her inventory notebook open and said, "If you go out there and get hurt, this place turns into a tomb. I can't drag you back down that ladder." And I told her, if we never look, we won't know when it's safe to move or when it's not safe to come back at all. And she held my gaze for a long second, calculating the risk. Then said, "Once a week, daylight hours only, and you come back clean. No heroics." Before that first recon check, she made me change into clean outer layers and pack the gear the same way every time, because routine cuts mistakes when adrenaline hits. She stood by the ladder with wipes ready and said, "Hands first when you come back, then we check exposed skin for cuts." And I answered, "Yes, because arguing about hygiene in a 60 square FT room is a losing game." The climb out felt wrong, like stepping into a world that had rejected us. I cracked the hatch, listened for a full minute, then opened it fully and moved slowly. I stayed off open ground, used the brush for cover, and stepped on roots when the mud wanted to record every move because a clean boot track is basically an invitation. At the edge of the suburb, the view tightened my stomach. Cars sat crooked in driveways, with doors hanging open. A tipped trash can spilled refuse across a sidewalk like nobody cared enough to fix it. Farther down toward the main road, heavy smoke hung low and a siren rose up and then cut off mid-note. The whole place looked paused. Then movement showed up slow and aimless. Two figures drifted through an intersection without looking left or right. One bumped into a street sign and kept pushing against it for seconds before sliding around it. They moved like people half asleep or drugged, their joints stiff from the cold like frozen hydraulics. But the dried blood on a jawline and the vacant way they turned told the truth. A third wandered out behind them, and the three disappeared between houses like they lived there now. Coming back mattered more than going out. No rushing. Boots stayed on the tray. Hands got scrubbed. Then I sat down and told Emma what I saw. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she exhaled and said, "So the cold slows them down." Then I looked at the bins and added, "Then we get tighter." Tighter meant quiet upgrades. We stuffed insulation behind a few cold spots in the wall boards, sealed a draft around the ladder frame with foam strips, and taped a plastic vapor barrier behind one corner where the boards felt damp. Emma pressed the tape down and said, "Dry and warm keeps your brain working." And I answered, "And quiet keeps the neighbors away." We also changed how we cooked. Anything that smelled strong like canned chili stayed sealed. We ate simple carbs with the vent working overtime even when it cooled the room. Emma wiped the condensation when she found it and muttered, "Mold is not moving in with us." Like that was the enemy she refused to lose to. The next weekly check was colder. I pushed out a little farther, close enough to see our own street, and a new detail showed up that stopped me cold. An extra vehicle sat in our driveway. A dark lifted pickup that wasn't ours. My first thought was looters. My second thought hit harder because I recognized the truck. It belonged to Wade, a guy I hunted with who lived 40 minutes out in the country. That meant he decided our house was worth the drive. No one walked outside to greet him, just that truck sitting there, parked crooked and sloppy like he'd arrived in a panic. I didn't go closer. I backed out the way I came, kept my pace steady, and didn't let anger pull me into a stupid confrontation right then. Back underground, Emma read my face before I even took my jacket off. She set her knife down, wiped her hands, and said, "Tell me." I told her Wade is at our house, and her eyes narrowed instantly. "Your hunting buddy, Wade?" She asked, and I nodded. She let out one sharp breath and said, "So he moved in." And the edge in her voice was pure, unfiltered honesty. "I don't know that for sure." I tried playing devil's advocate, but she didn't let me soften it. She leaned forward and said, "The people don't drive 40 minutes across a lockdown zone just to check on you. They drive to take shelter and take food." And she added, "If he's there now, he's going to be there tomorrow. And he knows you have supplies." She was right. And that meant the next trip wasn't about watching slow walkers from a distance. It was about handling someone who knew my name and knew my habits. That night, the shelter felt smaller than usual. Emma lay quiet for a while, then rolled closer and said, "I'm not mad you built this place anymore. I'm mad that we actually need it." And I answered same, and held her hand until her fingers warmed up. Morning brought the decision I didn't want to admit out loud. "I'm going back to check the house properly," I said. Emma looked at me, assessing the threat, and said, "You go armed, you keep it short, and you leave the second it feels wrong." And I answered, "I will." I packed light, waited for daylight, and climbed toward the cold air, knowing the harder threat wasn't the dead thing's music in the street, but the desperate friend in my driveway. The cold settled in for real, and the ground above us started to feel harder and denser under every step. Freezing rain turned into sleep, then into a heavy snow that stuck and stayed, and the shelter stopped feeling temporary. It became the default reality we woke up in, ate in, and tried to stay sane in. The first major upgrade was the walls. The initial boards were solid, but a few corners were acting as thermal bridges, leaking the cold in until it crawled along the floor and numbed your feet. Emma ran her palm along one seam, frowned, and said, "This spot is bleeding heat like an open wound." Then she tapped the board and added, "If we fix this, you burn less wood, and that means you don't have to go up there as often." That logic was impossible to argue with, so we pulled out the insulation rolls, plastic sheeting, tape, and screws, and we worked slowly so the room never lost its core temperature. Plastic went in first as a vapor barrier where the dirt side could sweat. Then the foam, then the boards tightened back down. It wasn't pretty, but the stove stopped fighting the outside temperature so hard, and that meant fewer dangerous trips for firewood. Emma watched me feed a smaller fire that night and said, "This is how you get through a winter. You cut your workload before you're too exhausted to move." And she was right, because every trip outside was a lottery ticket for getting wet, getting hurt, or getting seen. Once the room held heat better, Emma started talking about food in a different way. Not just consuming what we had, but producing something without leaving the hole. One evening, she sat at the table with her notebook in a sealed bucket and said, "We should use that back corner for mushrooms." The idea hit me wrong at first, because indoor agriculture sounded like moisture, mess, and trouble. And I told her, I don't want this place turning damp and smelling like rot. Then I pointed at the fresh work and added, "We just fixed the walls to keep moisture out." Emma didn't push back like it was a debate. She treated it like a problem to solve. She nodded and said, "That's why we do it in a controlled environment." Then she looked around and mapped it out. The far end of the shelter was cooler and away from the bed, and a heavy plastic curtain could create a microclimate, so humidity stayed on one side. "Mushrooms don't need sunlight," she said, tapping the bucket. "And winter actually helps because the outside air is cold and dry, so we can vent for a minute and reset the humidity if it spikes." So we built the nook, a tarp on the floor, 2 littered buckets on a low shelf, and that curtain hung from a wire so it could slide back when we needed access. Emma wiped everything down like she was setting up a lab using soap wipes and clean water. A small hydrometer went on the shelf, because guessing is how you grow toxic mold instead of food. She handed the sensor to me and said, "If the number drifts into the red, we fix it early." And I answered, "Yes, ma'am." The routine helped more than I expected. That corner gave her a daily job that felt normal and technical, and it gave both of us something to watch that wasn't the radio or the naughty pine ceiling. The shelter stayed cozy in a way it hadn't before. Socks dried on the line by the stove. The cast iron ticked softly while sleet hit the trunk overhead. On the worst nights, when distant noise drifted from town, we kept the light low and let the wood stove do its steady work. Small friction still showed up, because stress finds any crack in a relationship. I liked my gear stacked a certain way by the ladder, fast to grab in a panic, and Emma kept moving things to keep the floor visually clean. One time my gloves weren't where they belonged, and I snapped, "Don't reorganize my exit strategy." And she looked up from wiping the table and said, "Then don't drop wet gloves where we eat dinner." And the point landed. Gloves went back in the bin. The table stayed clean. Nobody needed a bigger fight than the one waiting outside. By the end of the week, the bucket started showing fine white threads of mycelium. And Emma leaned in close, smiled, and said, "Good. It's alive." That tiny wind mattered because it proved we weren't just rotting in a box. We were building something. The problem we couldn't insulate away was Wade. His music truck was still sitting up at our house, and every day it stayed there made it more likely he'd become a beacon. If he started tearing through closets or banging around in the garage, he'd attract eyes to the property and eventually to the woods. The next morning, after Emma checked the stove and the buckets, I packed light and checked the action on my rifle. "I'm going up to see what he's doing before he draws a crowd," I said. She nodded once and answered short and quiet, "Then come back to me." Fresh snow changed the entire tactical landscape of the neighborhood. It made the night brighter, amplifying the ambient light, but it also kept a perfect ledger of everyone who moved. Footprints stayed sharp and accusing, and a single broken branch looked like a neon sign pointing the way. I came in the long way, circling through the drainage easement and cutting through the back fences so I could get eyes on my driveway before anyone saw me. WD's dark pickup was still there, parked at a drunk angle across the concrete like he'd rolled in fast and didn't care who saw him. A thin beam of light flickered behind our living room curtains, not steady like a lamp, but restless like somebody packing with a tactical flashlight. That told me he wasn't just sleeping off the drive. He was searching for keys, for supplies, or for a clue where I went. Walking away was the safe move. But Wade wasn't a stranger. He hunted with me, drank my coffee, sat in my garage, and talked gear for hours. If he ever spotted me leaving the area, he'd follow out of curiosity or desperate need. I needed one clean conversation, one clear boundary, and then I needed to disappear again. I kept the rifle slung tight, muzzled down, and knocked on the kitchen door with my knuckles. No pounding, no police knock, just the sound a normal person makes. I waited, listened to the silence, then knocked again. The door opened a few cautious inches. WD's face filled the gap, his beard untrimmed, eyes rimmed red like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. Relief flashed across his face first, then it hardened instantly into a look of ownership. He pushed the door wider and said, "There. Where the hell have you been?" I stayed planted on the porch and said, "I'm checking my house, Wade." And he answered with a sharp, incredulous laugh, "Your house was empty. The phones were dead. I figured you bilayed for the coast." His eyes slid past me, scanning the tree line. And he added, "You've got somewhere else, don't you? You didn't just walk out of the woods." A woman's voice drifted from the living room, tired and tight with stress. "Who is it?" Wade called back over his shoulder, "It's there." And then he looked at me again and said, "Come in, man. It's freezing out here." I didn't move an inch. "Talk here," I said, keeping my tone calm but flat. WD's smile thinned out. He glanced at the rifle on my sling and said, "Don't act like I'm the problem here. We drove 40 minutes through hell. People are biting each other in parking lots. We needed a safe place." "I get it," I said, keeping my voice even. "But you didn't ask. You just moved in." Wade opened his hands like the answer was obvious and said, "Ask who? Your phone didn't work. Your neighbors are hiding behind their blinds. The whole town's gone sideways. I'm not sleeping in my truck with my wife." That last word landed hard because I still hadn't seen her. Wade stepped back and the door swung wider, revealing the hallway. His wife stood there, coat zipped to the chin, hair damp at the temples like she'd been sweating through a fever. One hand stayed tucked behind her hip, and her eyes looked a little cloudy, possessing a glassy stare that had to work too hard to focus on me. I didn't stare, but I clocked the details. Fast, shallow breathing through her nose, her weight shifting awkwardly like she was hiding pain. Wade noticed my glance and stepped into my line of sight. "She's fine," he said too quickly. "She's just cold and tired." I asked one question, slow and clear. "Is she hurt?" She swallowed hard and said, "No." But her hidden hand didn't come forward. Wade answered for her, blocking the doorway space. She slipped out of the truck on the ice. He said, banged her arm up. "That's it." My stomach tightened into a knot. "Show me your hand," I said to her, not yelling, just firm. Wade snapped back off there. And he stepped between us. His wife's eyes darted around the room, and she whispered, "Wade, stop." But it came out thin and wheezing, like she didn't have enough air in her lungs. I kept my feet planted on the frozen porch and said, "Wade, I'm leaving. You can stay here for now, but you do not follow me, and you do not ask where I'm going." His face hardened into something ugly. "So you do have a place," he said, his voice dropping low. "You've been hiding out while we were exposed." I didn't argue the semantics. "I have a plan for my wife," I answered. "That's my job. Yours is here." Wade took a step closer, crowding the threshold. "We're your friends. You don't get to just disappear and leave us out here to die." I shook my head once. "This isn't a group project," I said. "I'm not running a refugee shelter." His jaw worked like he was chewing on the answer, trying to find a way around it. Then his eyes flicked back to his wife, and I saw raw fear push the anger aside. His right hand slid behind the door frame and came back holding a compact pistol pointed at my chest instead of the floor. He didn't look brave. He looked cornered and terrified. "I'm not asking any more," he said, voice shaking with adrenaline. "You take us with you, or you tell me where it is right now." My rifle was slung and my hands were open. If I backed up, he would follow. If I ran, he might shoot anyway out of panic, so I moved forward. My left hand slammed onto his wrist to deflect the line of fire, and my shoulder drove into his chest. The pistol fired once, deafening in the small kitchen, and pain exploded in my right shoulder like a hot sledgehammer. We hit the counter hard, a chair toppled with a crash. Wade grunted and tried to wrench the gun free, and I smashed his wrist against the door jamb until his grip loosened. Behind him, his wife made a wet guttural sound, half gasp and half growl. Her hidden hand flashed into view for a second, and the bite was obvious. Teeth marks torn and dark with necrosis near her wrist. She stepped forward, mouth open, eyes wrong, drawn to the movement and noise like a simple machine. That was the last piece I needed. I shoved Wade back into her, kicked the fallen chair between us to create a gap, and stumbled out the kitchen door into the cold. My right arm hung heavy and useless. Blood soaked my sleeve instantly. Wade shouted my name, then shouted for his wife, and the sounds turned messy and violent like panic arguing with denial. I slammed the heavy door shut and threw the deadbolt with my left hand. The lock clicked home. The door shook once as something hit it hard from the inside. I didn't wait for a second hit. I turned and ran. The air was so cold it burned my throat, and the street lights cast long, distorted shadows on the snow. I kept my head down and stayed off the open sidewalks where I could. The snow grabbed at my boots, and my shoulder burned with white-hot fire with every step. I forced myself to breathe slowly and keep moving, because stopping was how you bled out or got followed. At the tree line, I broke my path hard to the left, looped wide, and then headed back toward the deep woods because a straight trail is a gift, and music wasn't giving way to gift. The trek back to the tree became a blur of adrenaline crash and freezing agony. My right arm wasn't just useless. It felt like it was on fire. A dead weight dragging me down into the snow. The fresh powder hit old tracks, but highlighted every stumble I made. Music, so I had to force myself to take a messy, indirect route through the deadfall. By the time the massive trunk filled my vision, my legs were shaking uncontrollably from shock. I didn't have to fumble for the latch. The hatch clicked open before I even touched it. Emma was already there scanning the dark woods. She saw the dark wet patch soaking my sleeve, and her face went tight, but she didn't scream. "Don't try to jump down," she ordered, her voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. She reached up, grabbed my belt with one hand, and my good arm with the other. "I've got you. Lean left. 3 points of contact." It was a clumsy, painful descent with her taking most of my weight until my boots hit the floorboards. I slumped onto the folding chair, breathless. "It's my right shoulder," I managed to say, the words coming out clipped and thin. Emma nodded, grabbed the first aid bin, and said, "Breathe slow. Don't try to be tough there, because I need you alive, not brave." She used trauma shears to cut the thick jacket sleeve open, peeling the fabric back. The cold air hit the raw wound, making my stomach roll, but Emma didn't flinch. "It's through and through," she said more to herself than to me, relief washing over her face. "It missed the bone, but it's messy." She poured clean boiled water over it to flush the debris, then pressed a thick pad of gauze down to stem the bleeding. "No digging," she said firmly. We cleaned the surface, we stopped the bleeding, and we watched for fever like a hawk. She cleaned the edges with antiseptic, then wrapped the shoulder tight. Not so tight that my hand went numb, but tight enough that the pressure throbbed in time with my heart. She handed me a heavy dose of ibuprofen and a cup of water and said, "Swallow these, then you eat oatmeal. Shock is the real killer right now." I wanted to argue that I wasn't hungry, but she was right. I ate slowly, my good hand shaking while she kept talking like a rope for me to hold on to. "We keep it warm," she said, packing the room. "We keep it sterile. You rest." I handled the ladder, and the wood runs from now on. That shift hit me harder than the bullet. The plan had always been that I acted as the perimeter security and the laborer. Now her hands were doing both, and mine were liabilities. The next few days blurred into a feverish loop of small checks. Emma changed the dressing twice a day, scrubbing her hands raw before and after, and she kept the used bloody gauze sealed in double bags so the shelter didn't smell like a slaughterhouse. She watched my skin color, checked my temperature every few hours, and asked one clear question: any dizziness? If I winced, she adjusted the wrap and said, "Tell me before it gets worse, not after." The firewood runs became her burden. She went up only when the wind masked the sound, carrying short loads to avoid fatigue. And she meticulously wiped the ladder rungs when she came back so we didn't slip. Cooking became her domain, too. Simple meals that conserved fuel, rice, canned meat, and eventually dried mushrooms from her buckets. The first time she fried a handful in the cast iron pan, and the earthy smell filled the room. She smiled and said, "We grew that down here." And it felt like the first real victory since the gunshot. Guilt tried to crawl in during the quiet hours. One night I stared at my sling and whispered, "If I hadn't gone up there, none of this would happen." Emma sat on the edge of the bed, looked straight at me and said, "If you hadn't gone, we'd be guessing about the threat level, and guessing gets people killed." Then she softened her tone and added, "You made the hard call. Now let me make mine." Her hand slid into my good one, and for a moment the shelter felt like a home again, not a cage. We talked more after that, mostly about how a new marriage doesn't come with instructions for the apocalypse. Emma admitted, "When you first told me about this place, part of me wanted to scream at you." And I answered, I deserved that. She nodded and said, "Then we agree on one thing. We stay out of crowds, even if it means being lonely." By the time the throbbing in my shoulder dulled to a manageable ache, the lesson was carved in stone. Movement was risk, and risk didn't pay. Weekly scouting was over. Emma taped a note to the shelf above the stove that read, "Slow is smooth." And every time I reached for my jacket, she'd tap it and raise an eyebrow. Outside, the neighborhood could burn or freeze. Inside, we kept the stove fed, the air moving, and the routines holding the line. Winter was still young, and the goal was simple: make it to spring without giving anyone a reason to come looking for us. Winter dug in and refused to leave. Snow came, melted into slush, and came again. And the massive oak above us bore the weight like a shield. The shelter stayed quiet. The stove stayed steady. Emma kept the mushroom corner sterile and organized. And every time a small flush came in, she dried a handful and labeled the bag with the date like it mattered. Because down here, details are what keep you civilized. My shoulder healed at its own stubborn pace. Some mornings it felt fine, and by afternoon the deep ache reminded me to stop pretending I was back to 100%. Emma didn't let me rush it. When I reached for my heavy coat, she'd look at the bandaged spot and simply say, "Not today." And I'd answer, "Okay." Because the last thing I wanted was a setback that forced her to carry the entire load again. We stopped talking about when it ended. We talked about what we could control. BTU output, water rations, clean hands, and staying boring. If we went up, it was strictly for wood, and only when the weather masked the sound, and we came back the same way every time, slowly, checking the ladder, wiping our boots, and keeping our voices below a whisper. Sometimes late at night, the hand-crank radio would catch a weak static-filled signal, a clipped message about road closures or emergency aid centers, but nothing that sounded like a solution. Emma would listen head tilted, then set it down and say, "That's not for us." And I'd nod because we knew that the people who gather in those places become targets. And we had already learned the hard way what desperate friends will do. We didn't celebrate our first month underground, but one evening after dinner, Emma leaned into me and said, "I miss stupid problems." And I answered, "Me too." Then added, "I miss complaining about escrow inspections." She laughed once, quiet and genuine. And for a minute, it felt like the world outside wasn't pressing in on the walls. If there's one lesson I keep circling back to, it's that this place isn't magic. A hidden shelter doesn't fix the collapse of the world. It just buys you time. Time to stay out of the chaos. Time to heal. Time to think before you act. We keep a simple checklist taped to the wall. Water level would stack, medical supplies, batteries, and the latch. It's not hero stuff. It's just repeating the basics until the basics keep you alive for one more day. I built this place because I'm the kind of person who always wants an exit strategy. Emma made it livable because she's the kind of person who keeps things clean and growing. Together, we turned a hole in the ground into a routine that holds. Spring will come eventually. When it does, we'll decide what's next. Until then, we keep the stove fed, the air moving, and the door in the tree closed. And we keep our family small, quiet, and alive. If you enjoyed the story, please hit that like button, subscribe for more survival narratives, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next.